As we get into writing research papers, sometimes people can feel like they need to try to sound smarter or more academic. This can come from a place of feeling inadequate in your writing, or like you're an imposter, or maybe just from expectations teachers in the past have had for your writing. Our course goals, as outlined by the university, say that we should employ format, syntax, punctuation, and spelling appropriate to various rhetorical situations in a stylistically sophisticated manner. The key takeaway here is that rhetorical element of language. You may have noticed that in our rubrics for the class, there are no requirements for a certain level of grammar, punctuation, or spelling. That's for a number of reasons, but one of them is for us to recognize the rhetorical nature of language. So what does it mean to say that language has a rhetorical nature to it? It means that the language we choose can affect our audiences in different ways. Oftentimes, people do this by changing their voice in a piece of writing. Voice is affected by lots of things, but we can think about it now as tone and vocabulary. If you've ever tried to sound smart in a piece of writing, it was because that's what you thought your audience expected of you. You want to come across as credible, so you might change your vocabulary to use words that you typically wouldn't. Maybe you've been taught that using first-person pronouns in writing is wrong, so you say something that feels unnatural, something like, one might have the experience that, ... right? Maybe you're changing your writing by taking out all of the contractions. All of those things affect the tone and voice of your writing. Changing your voice isn't inherently good or bad. I encourage students to write in their authentic voice. You've done the research and you have the knowledge, so you don't have to try to sound smarter. You're smart enough. Just tell us what you know. Different audiences have different expectations though, so it's important to be considerate of what your audience might want from you and make your choices accordingly. The concept of multimodality plays a role here too. If you're not familiar with this from 103, that's okay. We'll get into it more later in the course. But for now, we can think about the oral mode, or communicating by what you can hear. When we talk about voice then, it might be our literal voice. Again, our tone, volume, and vocabulary can change, and that all has an impact on our audience. Likewise, we might change our voice in writing to appear like we're part of a group. My example for this is Brian Kelly, the football coach. He went from being the head coach at Notre Dame to being the head coach at LSU a number of years back. And shortly after moving to Louisiana, he had a press conference. And in the press conference, whether it was intentional or not, he started to speak with a Southern accent. And audience members were not a fan of it. Not a fan of it. To many people, it seemed disingenuous, like he was putting on a fake voice to get people to trust him or believe him. And because he came across as inauthentic, his audience wasn't swayed and it backfired. Something to consider when we're thinking about voice, whether multimodally or not, is dialect. A dialect is a type of a language distinct for its particular vocabulary or pronunciation, and that can vary based on region, culture, and more. So we have English as the umbrella language, but there are lots of different types of English that someone might speak. There's American English, British English, Australian English, and that's just to begin with, right? You're likely familiar with a number of different dialects in American English. There's a really fun quiz, fun in my opinion at least, by the New York Times that shows you where you're most linguistically similar and different based on how you pronounce different words and different terms that you have for things. I'll link it in the description so you can try it out, but I definitely recommend it just because it's interesting. But that quiz is there to show us perhaps what regional dialect you tend to speak in. I always end up with 3 cities close to Chicago because I grew up in that area, so my vocabulary and pronunciation of things mimics a Chicago accent. It's less strong now that I've moved away, but that's the dialect I tend to speak in. We recognize that all of these regional variations of English are acceptable, and they're valid, but something to really emphasize is that variations of English generally are acceptable, whether they're place-based, culture-based, class-based, or whatever. A lot of times African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, gets ignored as a valid way of speaking English, as Kellen Barta references in his TED Talk. But like he pointed out, there's a grammatical system there. It's simply another dialect of English, not some lesser form of it. If we can recognize regional variations of English, certainly we can recognize a cultural variation of English too. In fact, linguists believe and assert that a living language cannot be standardized, meaning that because our language changes so rapidly and so regularly, there's no such thing as standard English. There is no perfect English. In The Standard English Fairy Tale by Laura Greenfield, she writes that it is not the language which causes listeners to make assumptions about the speaker, but the attitudes held by the listeners towards the speaker that cause them to extend that attitude towards the speaker's language. So again, we're thinking here about how our audience perceives us, and that perception can affect our message, and it may make us want to change our voice sometimes. During this unit in the past, I have had students ask about code switching. If you're not familiar with the term, code switching is where people will change their voice and their language to meet audience expectations. Oftentimes, this means transitioning from one dialectical variation of English to a variation that mimics standard English. Code meshing, on the other hand, has really been pushed in the field of rhetoric and composition as a whole over the last decade or so. So code meshing is where speakers combine local, colloquial, vernacular, and world dialects of English with standard white English in formal documents, assignments, public discourse, and everyday conversation. So, for instance, if you've ever heard someone transition from speaking one language into speaking another language mid-sentence, you have witnessed code meshing. This happens a lot in all sorts of different situations, academically and non-academically. So scholars in English are starting to recognize its validity more, particularly at the level of higher education. It hasn't really caught on in primary education for lots of different reasons that we won't dive into here. But I want to reiterate here that as a teacher, I value your voice in a piece of writing. You get to make the choices of how you speak to your audience. You do not have to try to sound smarter for me at all. I don't care about that. And I'm not grading you based on how smart you sound or how perfect your grammar is. So as far as making connections go, when we think about our audience, we should also think about our language. If we're using language that isn't appropriate for our audience, our message will fail to get across. Sounding smart doesn't always mean you're communicating effectively. So don't make that your goal. Instead, make it your goal to write a paper where you understand and are proud of the rhetorical choices that you have made to connect with your audience. You are smart enough. Don't change your voice to sound smarter. So, now that we've covered all of that, if you have any questions as you're writing your research paper, feel free to make an appointment with the Writing Center, post a question on the catch-all discussion board, or send me an email and we can meet to talk things through. I look forward to seeing the authentic you in your research papers.